Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este evento organizado por la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de los Andes, la Facultad de Jurisprudencia de la Universidad del Rosario, el Gender Justice and Security Hub, Angelika, I always get it wrong, de la Universidad de los Andes y el London School of Economics. Y el grupo para la recolección y acceso a la información de la Jurisdicción Especial de Paz. Como saben, este es un evento que se va a llevar a cabo principalmente en inglés. Hemos previsto traducción simultánea, entonces quería explicarles a los que no estuvieran familiarizados con el uso de esa herramienta en la plataforma de Zoom. Simplemente en los botones de abajo donde está la opción del chat, por ejemplo, y la opción de reacciones, que tal vez es una que conocen. Hay un globo, un mapa mundi, un globito que dice interpretación. Si hacen clic allí van a poder ver unas opciones de escuchar todo el tiempo en inglés o escuchar todo el tiempo en español, o simplemente pueden no hacer nada y escuchar en el idioma en el que esté hablando cada persona en el momento. Muy importante advertir en este momento que el chat va a estar abierto y si quieren plantear sus preguntas por el chat a lo largo de las intervenciones, estaremos pues felices de retomarlas y plantearlas a quienes están haciendo la presentación, a nuestras invitadas de hoy. También en el espacio que tengamos disponible al final, podemos abrir los micrófonos para aquellas personas que quieran hacer preguntas y como nos ha advertido y explicado Alejandro López, nuestro traductor, siéntanse cómodos y cómodas de utilizar el idioma con el que se sientan más tranquilos. Él hará el trabajo de la traducción por ustedes, así que pues bienvenidas esas participaciones. Queremos que pues este sea un espacio muy interactivo. Voy a pasar ahora al inglés para dar la bienvenida a nuestras invitadas de hoy y los dejaré después de esta breve introducción, voy a dejarlos con la profesora Angelika Rettberg, que será la moderadora en el día de hoy. And just before going into precise introductions of each one of our guests, I want to again, welcome you and explain a bit about this series of conversations that we have organized around sexual violence in armed conflicts. We've set up 3 different events. One of them already happened last May 10th, and we had a conversation on feminist positions vis-a-vis sexual violence in general. And we touched upon some of the aspects that this conversations, some of the implications of these conversations for armed conflict, but our focus was the difference among feminists relating sexual violence and how to address it. And in particular, what are the costs of judicializing sexual violence and how different feminists have disagreed on the cost of judicialization. I think it was quite interesting. I was one of the panelists in that event, and we also had Professor María Luisa Rodríguez from Universidad Nacional and Professor Lina Céspedes from Universidad Rosario. The second event is dedicated to the ways in which international law has been mobilized to address women's rights in armed conflict, but in particular sexual violence in armed conflict. Our guests have recently published on this topic and are quite influential voices in the global debate on issues regarding sexual violence in armed conflict. We will have a third event in which we will hear from experts in the criminal investigation of sexual violence in context of armed conflict, the challenges that arise in those particular contexts, and also the opportunities and conceptual I would say, conceptual innovations that we have to address or understand sexual violence in context of armed conflict. That last event will take place on June 8th, so we hope you will all be able to join us. We will send more precise information on that event. I hope next week. We have been working hard to make each one of these conversations very meaningful for all of us. So it takes a little bit more of tinkering to have them ready. We will let you know. So today, as I said, we have with us Professor Catherine O'Rourke, Professor Karen Engle, and Angelika Rettberg. Dr. Catherine O'Rourke is Senior Lecturer in the School of Law and Director of the Transitional Justice Institute at the University of Ulster. She researches, teaches, and engages in policy work in the fields of gender, conflict, transitional justice, and international law. Her research has been supported by funders such as the Socio-Legal Studies Association, the Irish Government's Reconciliation Fund, and the UK's Department for International Development. Her scholarship has been recognized with the Irish Fulbright Scholar Award and the Basil Chubb Prize for the best PhD in politics produced in an Irish university. Catherine holds an LLB in law with politics from Queen's University, Belfast, and a Master's of Science in Gender from the London School of Economics. Her PhD from Ulster University Transitional Justice Institute was subsequently published as a monograph, Gender Politics in Transitional Justice, Routledge, 2013. Her most recent book, which will be the one that will be part of the conversation today, is Women's Rights in Armed Conflict Under International Law. It was published last November by Cambridge University Press. Karen Engle is Minerva House Drysdale Regents Chair in Law and founder and co-director of the Bernard and Audre Rapoport Center for Human Rights and Justice. She is also an affiliated faculty member of Latin American Studies and of Women's and Gender Studies. She teaches courses and specialized seminars in public international law, international human rights law, and legal theory. Professor Engle writes on the interaction between social movements and law, particularly in the fields of international human rights law, international criminal law, and Latin American law. She is author of The Grip of Sexual Violence in Conflict, Feminist Interventions in International Law, published last year by Stanford University Press. Professor Angelika Rettberg is a professor at the Political Science Department at Universidad Los Andes, where she leads the research program on armed conflict and peace building. Since 2019, she is a co-director of the Transformation and Empowerment stream of the London School of Economics-led and UK Research Institute or Initiative funded Hub on Gender, Security and Justice. She is also a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, a visiting fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics. In 2018, she served as a negotiator for the Colombian government in the peace talks with the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, ELN. Her research has focused on the private sector as a political actor and specifically on business behavior in context of armed conflict and peace building. She has also been involved in research about other aspects of the political economy of armed conflict and peace building, such as the relationship between legal resources, armed conflict and crime, as well as the dynamics of transitional justice and reconciliation. So these were quite extensive presentations, but I just have to say the three of them are very good friends to me, and I'm very happy to have them with us today. I'm very moved that they accepted this invitation, and I hope we all enjoy the conversation. Now I pass it on to Angelika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, Cristina. I'm honored to be a part of this panel this morning. Thank you also to Karen and to Catherine. It's a pleasure to meet you, albeit online, but this is what we have in these pandemic times. I would really love to be sitting in a room and actually have the chance to talk with you over coffee as well. But since this is not our opportunity at this point, we'll just leave it on Zoom and make this as dynamic and as friendly as possible. So first of all, thanks. I guess I will join Cristina in my thank you to you for accepting this invitation to this Universidad Los Andes organized event. And I will just briefly perhaps say something about the Gender Justice and Security Hub that I lead. This is a UKRI, it's I for Innovation actually, Isabel, Cristina, institute. It's an institute in the United Kingdom, and it's based at the London School of Economics. I lead the regional office of the hub here in Colombia at Los Andes. The hub's quite interesting because it focuses on more than 8 countries on issues related to gender justice and security, with scholars in very different disciplines who share and join and nurture links with civil society leaders as well as with public officials. So our work is to both, our goal is to both impact scholarship as well as policy making on these matters. So the issue that we will be discussing today is incredibly relevant to the hub's work, and therefore I'm also thankful to be part of this conversation. And I admit I am not an expert on sexual violence in conflict at all, so I am here as a student of yours as well, and my questions of course relate to our shared interest in understanding your work better, understanding your arguments better. So let's just jump right into it and just make sure that we use the time as best as possible. I will first, perhaps just to frame our discussion, ask both of you to briefly sum up the arguments you make in your respective books for our audience today. And I will first ask Karen to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very sincerely for the invitation. It's very nice to be a part of this discussion. When I was doing my doctoral work, I sort of hung out in Los Andes Library quite a bit. So I regret that I can't be there in person, but send good greetings from Belfast and hope that we can do this in person soon. So my book, which was published last year, it was motivated really by a very clear trend in international law since the early 1990s towards the increased regulation of women's rights in conflicts under international law. And this provides quite a marked contrast from what had preceded it, which would have been largely characterized as silence and absence. And indeed, a large portion of the early section of the book is dedicated to documenting these developments and analyzing them. What particularly interested me in terms of writing the book was the fact that these developments happened across different regimes of international law. So we saw them in international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, and developments at the UN Security Council. And I know Isabel, Cristina suggested it would be helpful to just give a hint of what some of those key developments were so that we might have a shared understanding. And I mean, very briefly, we could trace this story back to a number of places, but one would be 1993 and the UN Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, where there was a very important civil society gathering in the basement of that UN meeting, where women gathered to tell stories of their experiences of violence. At the end of that conference, they went upstairs and presented their demands to states. And had really quite a remarkable degree of success, actually, in the demands that they made to the UN, to the state representatives at that time. And what we saw after that was a UN General Assembly declaration on violence against women, a general recommendation from the CEDAW Committee on Violence Against Women, a new special rapporteur on violence against women. And whilst those developments, obviously, they weren't specifically about women's rights in conflict, to the extent that they discussed violence against women, they also talked about violence against women in conflict. And then at Beijing, the Beijing conference in 1995, the UN's Fourth World Conference on Women, that is where we see this question of women's rights in conflict actually be emerging as a clearer theme in terms of international norms and governance, where women's rights in conflict is one of the 12 areas of concern, and big emphasis in that discussion around the importance of women's participation in decision-making as it pertains to conflict and its resolution. And then linked to those developments were things going on in international criminal law, the ad hoc tribunals in the early 1990s, prosecuting in many cases for the first time, particularly sexual violence and armed conflict, and those developments being codified in 1998 with the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. And then the last thing I'll point to then is the Security Council, which in the UN Security Council, which in 2000, picking up this theme of women's participation from Beijing in 1995, the Security Council adopted a resolution where it adopted commitments to a women, peace and security agenda that included a number of things, but the question of women's participation being very prominent. That agenda has unfolded at the Security Council in ways that has underpinned a number of developments around accountability for sexual violence and armed conflict. So the book documents all of that, certainly in a great deal more detail. But it looks at it in particular. So I was, one of the things that interests me in terms of the book is how certain key things are defined under international law. Obviously, the first one being conflict. So how is conflict defined under these different regimes of international law? Are there definitions that are more or less women-friendly, women-inclusive? And I'm also very interested in how these different regimes define women's rights. And that was in order to do that, I have a general discussion, but I also look at a couple of case studies where I try to see, I look at Colombia, Nepal and the DRC to see how sexual violence in those conflicts is dealt with. And I look across the three conflicts and how institutions of international law address sexual violence in those conflicts. And I also look across those three conflicts I had to pick one other. I decided to work through a series of what I call emblematic violations. And I looked at other violations that weren't about sexual violence, because unlike sexual violence where we've had lots of legal developments, my premise was if international law has really improved its responses to women's experiences of conflict, we should be able to see evidence of that not only in response to sexual violence, but actually in response to other violations that happen to women during conflict. So in Colombia, I looked at forced displacement. In the DRC, I looked at child soldier use and recruitment. And in Nepal, I looked at forced disappearances. And the book then attempts to make some broader assessments around international law's efficacy in responding to those violations specifically, but then more broadly, the extent to which we can say that this significantly increased international legal activity on women's rights in conflict, the extent to which it is resulting in improved accountability, but also prevention and rights promotion more broadly. I think I'll leave it there. I suppose conclusions. An overall argument. I mean, the book starts with the premise that we have a complex tapestry of legal obligations, and that is reinforced by the book's findings. What I do propose, however, is how this tapestry of obligations might be better utilized and maximized for the overall promotion of women's rights in conflict.
Thank you, Catherine. So, Karen, now, please.
Buenos días. Es un placer estar nuevamente en un evento en la Universidad de los Andes. Ciertamente, como dijo Angelika y Catherine, sería mejor estar en la universidad en persona, pero por lo menos aquí estamos conversando de diferentes partes del mundo. Y Catherine y yo estábamos hablando en Belfast y Texas hace 3 semanas o algo. Me gustaría agradecer a Isabel y Angelika por la invitación y la coordinación y a Catherine por su trabajo y la oportunidad de platicar con ella sobre nuestros libros. Ahora voy a continuar en inglés para asegurar la más claridad posible. So, transitioning, the broad questions I address in the book, in my book, are why and how the women's human rights movement became particularly gripped by sexual violence in armed conflict, and what have been some of the implications of that focus. Specifically, I'm interested in what happened in both international law and women's rights advocacy over the past 3 decades that made sexual violence in conflict a prominent issue and made international criminal law and sometimes militarized or securitized responses seem the obvious sites for addressing them. And what feminist approaches to peace, development, and global inequality were left on the cutting room floor as women's rights advocates homed in on sexual violence through human rights, international criminal law, and international security. And these questions are actually part of a larger study of mine on how human rights movements, including those on indigenous, Afro-descendant, and women's rights, take up law to pursue their aims. And I'm interested how in the process they end up shaping law, often in ways that they didn't expect. So in the 1980s, women's rights advocates were far from the center of international law of any sort. And I think Catherine's book bears that out as well. Yet amazingly, they made significant progress in a relatively short period in rallying the support of international legal institutions and actors. And I think that progress stems in no small part from their dominant focus on sexual violence in conflict. It's there that they've arguably achieved the most gains, had the most successes, but in ways I argue have often moved them away from, if not undermined, some of their initial aims. So just to say at this, well, I guess we're not still at the start, but sexual violence in conflict is both reprehensible and clearly illegal. And that's true as a matter of international human rights, humanitarian, and criminal law. No one disputes that. But I'm concerned about the distributive effects of a focus on sexual violence in conflict, both in terms of issues that do not get addressed as a result, as well as in the ways that that focus has shaped both international law and feminism. So let me get more specific. The majority of the book focuses on the women's human rights movement since the 1990s, when it both achieved consensus around and mainstream appeal with a preoccupation on sexual violence and conflict. And Catherine pins that moment on Beijing, but I actually see it as happening earlier at the UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, where there's the turn towards sexual violence in conflict. But I agree it's sort of solidified maybe in Beijing. I look at that consensus that was achieved at that time against the backdrop of other debates among internationally involved feminists in the 1970s and 80s, including, but not only those between feminists in the global north and those in the global south. So these feminists often disagreed about what were and should be most important, what should be the priorities. Should they be women's economic equality and maybe its relationship to imperialism and the legacies of colonialism? Should they focus mostly on violence against women, and if so, violence where, both geographically and site-based in the home or elsewhere? Should the focus on violence be about sexual oppression? And these and other disagreements played out in a variety of debates, including those around development, peace, and the treatment of sex work. So my book then works through a variety of international institutional legal sites and debates where the movement has had success in at least achieving recognition that sexual violence constitutes an international law violation. And I end up looking at the same institutions that Catherine looks at, or the same sort of sets of legal doctrines, which makes it a little bit easier to have this discussion, which are human rights, humanitarian law, international criminal law, and then work at the Security Council. But I argue that this great success has not come without significant costs. So in each of these sites, women's human rights advocates, and then blending into feminist international criminal lawyers, who some of whom used to be women's rights advocates, and even women's peace advocates, have produced and enforced or reinforced what I consider to be a problematic approach, not only to sexual violence and conflict, but to women, peace, and conflict more generally, and to international law. So this approach marks a victory for certain forms of feminism, or for a certain form of feminism, which some people would see it as a form of radical feminism, but I just like to be more specific and say it's one that sees sexual acts as central to male domination and female subordination. And it sees sexual domination as constituting the greatest structural impediment to women's emancipation. It also, this approach reflects the success of approaches to international law that are carceral and that are militarized. So together, these feminist and international legal approaches have brought a hyper attention to sexual harm, and then have often used that attention to pursue extraordinary responses. For example, or maybe not so extraordinary, but forceful responses that I think are problematic. So for example, feminists have participated in the deployment of allegations of mass rape and sexual violence to call for or justify military interventions in sites from Iraq to Libya. They've used those allegations to develop international criminal institutions and jurisprudence within them, often with dubious due process mechanisms. And they've used the allegations to promote a variety of security measures, including counterterrorism and countering violent extremism measures through the Security Council's agenda. They've also arguably made peace less achievable by opposing the inclusion in peace agreements of amnesty for any act of sexual violence in conflict. So in the process, they've often also facilitated, if not deployed, stereotyped images of victims and their families and communities. Most notably, these approaches often present women, particularly Muslim and African women and Muslim African women, and that has to do with some of the early cases that we're focused on, but as uniquely harmed by rape and sexual violence. Rape and sexual violence are considered to be fates worse than death, in large part because of the ways that these communities are imagined to respond with shame and stigmatization. And I'll be happy to say more about that later if folks are interested, but maybe for now to say that the communities themselves often become to be seen as part of the problem. Now, I think Catherine and I also agree that this approach has failed to make a significant dent on incidences of sexual violence in conflict. But for me, that just becomes more important because it's displaced many other feminist commitments, including those that might criticize some of these representations of women, as well as of the criminal and military responses to them. So that is, as feminists from around the world began to pay an enormous amount of attention to wartime rape and sexual violence in conflict, they often diverted attention from other issues with which they had been concerned, again in the 70s and 80s. In particular, they displaced much of the anti-militarism of the women's peace movement, the sex-positive positions of many feminists involved in debates about sex work and pornography, and third world or anti-colonial feminist critiques of economic maldistribution, imperialism, and cultural essentialism. So I'd say my principal aim with this book is actually to revive some of those earlier critiques, and to do that in part by seeing that the path that women's human rights took, both in its laser focus on sexual violence in conflict and its primary use of criminalized and militarized responses to it, was neither necessary nor natural. So women's human rights advocates, again, have achieved many victories around sexual violence and conflict. But it's time to take stock of those consequences, revisit our priorities, and perhaps even put our differences back on the table so that we can imagine human rights anew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you both for these really thought-provoking initial remarks on your books. I would like now to turn to the fact that many of these discussions and many of these facts that you're stating take place in the midst of of similar legal doctrinal fields and regimes, combining both international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, and UN Security Council resolutions. So I would like to ask you now how you feel that whether there are any differences within this, what Catherine called tapestry of obligations, and in what way this diversity actually lends itself or is an impediment. I would be interested in knowing your opinion on this for the kind of effects and for the kind of priorities that you both feel should be pursued in this field.
Thank you. I'll start with that. So this is something that I address quite explicitly in the book, particularly in the latter sections where I do set out what I contend really are the comparative advantages of the different regimes, you know, if you're an advocate with particular outcomes in mind. And I mean, to reduce this a great deal, I mean, essentially, if we start with international humanitarian law, in terms of sexual violence in conflict, it offers quite prescriptive definitions of sexual violence in armed conflict, both in terms of meeting the threshold for conflict, the temporal boundaries. So it has a very clear sense of before conflict, during conflict, after conflict, in a way that often conflict with feminist perspectives and women's experiences. However, the clear advantage of international humanitarian law, in my view at least, is an emphasis on prevention. And that's actually remarkably rare when it comes to international law, that there's an emphasis on engaging belligerent actors to educate them as to their obligations and to support them to refrain from violations. And that's primarily done through the International Committee of the Red Cross. IHL also offers unique protections around humanitarian response to victims. That again is unique to that regime. When we turn to international criminal law, it likewise offers a prescriptive definition of sexual violence in conflict. It relies on international humanitarian law for definition of war crimes. However, it is the unique vehicle really by which we can think about individual criminal accountability. It is in terms of international law, it is the unique mechanism by which we can do that, secure prosecutions. And as Karen was sort of getting to, what the book is very clear about doing is it charts these international legal obligations, but it also then looks in practice to what these international legal obligations are meaning in particular conflict sites in terms of how international institutions conduct their work. And when it came to this question of efficacy, if we can think about efficacy, so to what extent does the fact that we now have these international norms and obligations, to what extent is that translating into increased prosecutions, if that's your objective? What was very clear really across the case studies was, we're seeing very limited criminal accountability actually. And I think that's perhaps another perspective on the sorts of work that Karen is doing, that I think even if we buy into the grip of sexual violence and the idea that it's a suitable objective to advocacy, I think when we look more closely at the sorts of dividends it's producing, certainly through my research and my case studies, it was very clear that we were getting, you can tell two stories. You can tell this kind of a doctrinal story that says we've had all of this landmark legal developments, we have the Rome Statute, but when you actually look to sort of what is that meaning in terms of criminal accountability in conflict settings, there's very little to point to. Then in terms of international human rights law, I mean, as you would expect, it is the regime best tailored to addressing state complicity, the role of state actors and state forces, and it also includes guarantees around reparations and guarantees of non-recurrence. So it has a kind of broader set of guarantees. Also, interestingly, I didn't necessarily anticipate this, but when I looked at the case studies in more detail, I certainly found that it was only really under international human rights law that I found an effort to contextualize and situate incidents of sexual violence in conflict within much broader structural inequalities. So structural gender inequalities and other inequalities that sort of precede and underpin conflict. And actually that was done relatively well across the different human rights treaty bodies. And also, I mean, on the basis that, you know, the feminist project, I think, in this area is about substance, but it's also about process. And it's certainly the case that human rights law is the most amenable to civil society. And then finally, the Security Council. Well, the Security Council, of course, has unique enforcement authority, you know, up to and including the use of force. It has, over the last number of years, developed a set of the set of resolutions that certainly in theory could permit the authorization of the use of force to respond to sexual violence in conflict. So that's an extraordinarily robust potential response. We are seeing evidence of the Security Council using its sanctions authority in ways that target perpetrators of sexual violence. But again, a very prescriptive definition of sexual violence in conflict. And of course, it is a securitized response. And in all cases, I found that the key arbiter of what the key interlocutor of what the Security Council does in any conflict is in fact the state in which it's supposed to be doing that work. So, and I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Karen.
So I think I'll talk about my book. I've already given a pretty good sense of how I see the focus on sexual violence. And I suppose in some ways, Catherine's saying, well, one, it's not as singular of a focus as you're suggesting. And also it's not having the effects maybe on the ground, although we agree that mostly in terms of that, but I still think it's having effects. So maybe I'll just say, or begin by saying at some level, I do think I see less fragmentation than Catherine does, as I'm really focused on consistency across the institutional spaces. So for me, I should say, and I trace them back to the women's human rights movement. And that's because these other spaces have been quite connected to the human rights movement, as the human rights movement has decided, for example, to push for R2P, responsibility to protect, other Security Council sort of responses, but most importantly, international criminal law, which the human rights movement just pretty wholeheartedly not only accepted, but was really involved in pursuing. So it's important to me to go back to the women's human rights movement in order to see some of those earlier focuses that I just talked about, that I think we miss if we just look at where the different areas are today. And so even when you see glimpses of a focus on treatment of victims, on maybe having peaceful ends to conflict more generally, I think that they are very much subsumed by this larger attention to sexual violence in conflict. And in many ways, I think Catherine's book actually bears that out. And I think she'll talk about this a little bit more, and has already mentioned that sexual violence for her is emblematic. It's a great way to tell the fragmentation story because it does cut across all of those regimes. And so for me, the fact that it's become emblematic is actually part of the problem. Because I think it's harder and harder to find other explicitly articulated gender or sexual issues across the regimes. She points to some, but actually in every place it's a different one in the case study. It's not consistent in the same way that sexual violence is. So I think that that's really telling. And as larger concerns of gender or sexual equality have been narrowed, well, I would say they have been narrowed to sexual violence and conflict. So even other types of wartime harm that women experience, from death and the death of loved ones to displacement, loss of infrastructure, livelihood, and multiple forms of human security have still continued to be largely obscured by the intense focus on sexual harm. And I'll look at the Security Council, I'll give you an example from the Security Council Women, Peace and Security Agenda, because they had a very deliberate attempt, actually, to have sexual violence and conflict displace some of these other issues, even gender-based violence. There's a UN Action Sexual Violence Against Conflict is kind of it's an organization within the UN that's made up of representatives from a bunch of different programs. So I should say it's a program made up with representatives from others. And it has there's a special representative on sexual violence and conflict, which has pretty much headed that since it began. And in 2010, Margot Wallstrom was the special representative at the time, and she actually asserted that, quote, sexual violence as a tactic or consequence of war could not be captured under existing categories. And she was very interested in how they were going to be able to document sexual violence. So she called for the use of the term conflict-related sexual violence. And she explained what she thought was missing in the other categories. So I'm going to quote from her again. Quote, cases against men and boys did not fall under violence against women. And gender-based violence did not reflect sexual violence as a method of ethnic cleansing or a tactic of terror. Now, that view persisted. So in 2011, UN Action issued a summary of what its analytical and conceptual framing would be of this new category of conflict-related sexual violence. And it made clear that, quote, conflict-related sexual violence should no longer be treated as synonymous or interchangeable with, and then it gave a number of terms, including gender-based violence and violence against women. So for the listing purposes, so some of what Catherine was just talking about in terms of Security Council responses, one resolution 1960 and then subsequent ones require that individuals and groups be listed who are suspected, credibly suspected of committing sexual violence. And for the purpose of that list, the UN Action's framing included actually a list of crimes that was very focused on sexual violence. So rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. And that's the same definition that's in the ICC. But it also left no doubt about the potential set of victims. So something else is going on here, which is it's being very clear to add to women and girls, also men and boys as possible victims. So that means they broadened the category of victims in terms of men and boys, but they limited the harms concerned to physical sexual violence. And quite ironically, although intentionally you could hear it, any gender analysis disappeared. And that, I think, is really makes it that you can see that across all of the different regimes throughout the tapestry, even if you find little bits of threads here and there, which I'm really glad Catherine's pulling out. But I'll end by just saying it's not just that other issues have disappeared that I'm concerned about, but again, that focus on sexual violence really limits our ability to understand gender, as I've just said, and conflict more generally, and thinking about whether it's women and girls or also men and boys, but they come back and say, of course, it predominantly affects women and girls. We miss in any of these formulations the many roles that women actually play in conflict, in the continuation of conflict, whether as perpetrators or bystanders or citizens, political actors in a variety of ways.
Thank you so much, Karen. This is fascinating. I would like to turn now to you both have studied in order to develop your arguments. Catherine mentioned that her book is composed of several case studies. So I would like to now, and then also the fact that I'm a political scientist, of course, makes me obsessed about the question of agency, you know, like the relationship and how the structure of the law is used or is instrumentalized in both positive and negative ways by specific groups in order to achieve certain goals. So my specific question would be, you mentioned a lot of local feminist groups, Catherine, and you've seen and it illustrated how they can use international law. Can you give us an example to illustrate how these groups resort to or achieve protection of human rights at the local level using these international frameworks?
Sure, thank you. In truth, the book does certainly allude to this in terms of the potential role of and actual role of women's organizations in informing the development of the laws and norms that I look at. But it doesn't look, in terms of the case studies, it doesn't look at women's mobilization specifically. However, that is a theme in lots of other work I've done. So if it's okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit and just talk about some other work I've done in terms of that specific question. So why is it that feminists engage international law and to what ends and to what, with what efficacy? And in particular, there's a piece of work I did a few years ago now. It's published in the European Journal of International Law on feminist strategy in international law. And what I did for that article was I interviewed a bunch of activists, some here in Belfast where I live, who were active at the time. I continue to be active on trying to push the UK government to include Northern Ireland within its activities on the women, peace and security agenda, because the UK government has defined that as entirely outward looking and not with respect to conflict legacy within its own borders. And that's an issue. So I spoke to local activists about why they felt that was important and what was the value of international law in that work. I also then spoke to transnational activists, so folks kind of in places like Geneva and New York, who were also engaged kind of broadly on the same theme and who had done some work in some ways on this question of Northern Ireland and women, peace and security. And then I spoke to some women, what I called feminist insiders, so women within different institutions of international law, CEDAW, folks related to sort of the CEDAW committee, the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, UN Women. And I asked them all the same question in terms of sort of why were they engaging these instruments? What did they see as their value? With what efficacy? And I found when I spoke to, and there were quite clear distinctions actually in terms of, for the insiders, they were very concerned about the law. They were very concerned about the legal status of the obligation and the importance of state compliance and all of those things. But when I spoke to the local activists, they really didn't engage at all with this debate about whether or not women, peace and security resolutions were legally binding and what chapter of the charter they were adopted under. They talked about the political dividends of engaging international law, particularly the Security Council resolutions. And they described those political dividends in a few different ways. So they talked about it as useful for underpinning alliances between feminist organizations in Northern Ireland and more traditional human rights organizations in Northern Ireland. So those were organizations that for historical reasons haven't tended to work together, but because they could sort of point to an international instrument, actually they could put more pressure on local human rights NGOs to support their advocacy and more broadly to improve their gender sensitivity. And actually that was particularly important on contentious issues around transitional justice and conflict legacy. They talked about the political value of the resolution in terms of being able to circumvent the difficult kind of local officials and the difficult local government to go find allies outside of the national space. And in particular, the CEDAW committee, who's been quite strong on this question of the UK and 1325 in Northern Ireland. So international law opened up this whole new range of allies for advocacy because of this tool. They also talked about the political value of the resolution in terms of unlocking resources. And in fact, resources, I mean, in fact, you know, one of them sort of mused to me, you know, I'm just thinking did I put it in a funding application, you know, you know, being, you know, entirely strategic and instrumental about that. And interestingly, so whereas when I spoke to the transnational folks, and in particular the feminist insiders within international institutions, you know, who were quite concerned about the legal questions and the legal status and the nature of the obligation and that stuff that lawyers get really worried about. Actually, for the local activists, what they valued was what they saw as a flexibility to the language of particularly 1325 and its participation emphasis, that they felt that within that flexibility and indeed within the shadowy legal status, left space for them to articulate the obligation, you know, articulate those commitments in ways that were meaningful to those organizations. And one of the respondents said to me, you know, you make texts apply to what you do, don't you? Rather than the other way around. Okay. So what had been seen as a weakness in terms of the international lawyers actually was a strength for local activists. So that's just more broadly in terms of my work on in that area. I do want to say, and then just one final comment. As I say, I really don't look at this in detail in the book. It was just beyond the bounds of what I could do. But one example that popped up was an initiative was examined from Colombia, actually, and it was a submission made to the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC by Cisma Mujer and a couple of others, asking the OTP to improve its gender sensitivity in how it was determining that the Colombian state was in fact making kind of genuine efforts to prosecute sexual violence. And that was quite an interesting initiative because, again, it was sort of a local and a transnational organization, you know, organizing. It was a legal engagement, a legal intervention. It was an initiative that was about Colombia, but was also very much about, more broadly, how international law should be interpreted. It was, I mean, from what we can tell, it had no apparent effect on the thinking of the OTP, though. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Karen, similar question to you. Based on your findings on mobilization, what do you feel have been some of the costs of that mobilization in the field of international law?
Great, thank you. I mean, I think I've alluded to this somewhat already in my remarks, but maybe I'll try to emphasize a little bit more about the extent to which I think we need to be aware that international law might be part of the problem and not always the solution. And but I also think it's very interesting and important to think about the relationship of the local and global. And you know, Sally Engle talks about the vernacularization of movements as they emerge on the ground. I actually tend to see the local and the global interacting much more. And not necessarily in as positive ways as she did. But some people who agree with me generally on my approach or on my critique of the focus on sexual violence and conflict will say that really what I've pointed out is a problem of Western feminism being imposed on others. And I do really want to, I think I mean, I think at some level, we can definitely see those traces, but I also think it's important to think about basically when and where the focus on sexual violence began. So with Catherine, I see that, I mean, earlier I said Vienna, Beijing, but we both talk about the important role that the conflict in the former Yugoslavia played. And that was going on during Vienna, and it colored a lot of what was happening. And it meant, because there was a lot of media attention to rapes that were going on during the war, it meant that it would have been almost impossible for the conference not to focus on it. And amazingly, when they began with when they began organizing the World Conference on Women, or the UN World Conference on Human Rights, women and gender issues were not there at all. So feminists organized very concertedly, and then part of the reason why I think they succeeded was because of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Now, the debates around the former Yugoslavia were intense within the former Yugoslavia, and they were very much, the feminist positions often matched they did match whether or not feminists from different areas, or at that point, sometimes countries, sometimes regions, were taking sides, whether or not they thought that all sides needed to cease and desist, like Women in Black. But in terms of those who were really pushing that rape was not just a violation of international law, but was genocidal, that actually came from Croatian feminists. And that argument was itself actually a tool of conflict, because what they hoped to do by saying that it was genocidal was to get international intervention. And they were aided in that effort by Catherine McKinnon, who went on to have a big effect in international criminal law in particular. But they came to her, and she's very proud of saying they came to her. But actually, looking back at some of the materials that they had begun with, they were very focused on what they actually called it something like femicide at the time. And you know, that's an issue that comes up in international criminal law more generally. So when you say there's a bias against Africa in the ICC, the response will often be, but these African countries self-referred. And then you say, yeah, they did self-refer because they cleverly figured out that could aid them in their fight against rebels in their country or whatever. So, I mean, it's interesting. So I'm not really disagreeing with Catherine. She's giving some sets of examples where feminists organized around international law and it worked. I'm focusing on examples where I think organizing around international law doesn't work because it perpetuates and gives power to and takes advantage of the power of international legal tools that I think are highly problematic. So I guess that's to say that if we're going to rethink, or we need to rethink the very international legal institutions on which we rely, and be attuned to their ongoing colonial and global north biases, and recognize that those biases don't disappear when used at a local level or by feminists. And, you know, just maybe one other example, which I alluded to at the beginning, but is the ways in which sexual violence has been used, or the focus on it has been used by many feminists to fight or participate in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism. And that happens in ways that are partly hinged on old pathways for intervention that have resonances with colonial tropes of saving brown women from brown men, that invoke racialized and Islamophobic descriptions of other societies as misogynistic and intolerant. And that they do that in a way that presents those societies in contrast to those of the supposedly fair systems, right, that military might and fervor can use to fight terrorism. And I guess, you know, what worries me about this is that the same kinds of critiques aren't coming from within as they were before. And it's not to say that all political activism happens around international law, much of it does not. And I think that's really important too. I don't think we need to listen to what's happening on the streets of Bogota and try to put it into international law language. I think that sometimes does an injustice to the kinds of issues that are being framed that international law either can't address or makes worse.
Thank you, Karen. So now I will turn to some of the questions that have been raised by people in the audience. One question is a complex one, and again has to do with the location of power. And here the person is asking, unfortunately I don't know what the name is, but the person is asking whether or to what extent this focus on sexual violence is less a strategic mistake on behalf of feminist groups and more a reflection of what power I guess power understood as states and men in charge of the production of international law are interested in hearing. So the question, I guess, is where does this problem, where does this problem come from? What's the stem of it? And I'm happy to ask both of you to address this. I probably would ask Karen first.
So if I hear the question as being partly about, okay, sexual violence and conflict has been mainstreamed and it's been used in all of these ways that you don't like. But is that a feminist problem or is that an international law problem? And I guess my answer is that it's both. So I think that there are many people, especially in the 1325 context that Catherine was talking about, and among women who promoted 1325, I should say people in the women's peace movement that promoted 1325, that have started to say, so, and have said for a long time, actually, including Diado, that it was just a horrible mistake to go to the Security Council, because what did feminists think that they would be able to get given the power of that institution? And I agree with that, but I think it's too simple to say, as some have, that women's human rights movement or the peace advocates or their aims have simply been co-opted, especially by non-feminists. So that's why I frame my remarks by trying to give you some of the arguments by feminists themselves. So, feminists, including those originally behind 1325 and what they see as its progeny, they wanted to participate in the mainstream action. That was the whole reason they got involved, is they said, here is the power. And in doing that, my concern is that they've not only not countered, so they might use it in some of the ways Catherine talked about, but they don't push back against the other directions that it's gone. They haven't countered that because they've also attempted to take advantage of other feminist and non-feminist agendas that end up fueling panic about sexual violence. And, I think even structural bias feminists would agree, so I call them that in the book sometimes. So the feminists I described earlier, even they would agree that there are many ways in which the treatment of sexual violence has gone awry, either because it hasn't been enforced, as Catherine's talked about, or some of them would be very concerned that gender had disappeared. There's a debate among feminists on that. But again, they were the ones who elevated or acquiesced in the elevation of the harm of sexual violence as the principal harm to women in general, and especially in war. And when they were debating other feminists, sexual violence for them was gender violence and vice versa. And so it's not surprising that when they went out in the world, their language of sexual violence resonated that was in fact the goal with political and institutional actors across these various political, national, cultural, and religious lines.
Thank you, Karen. Catherine, would you like to speak to this point as well?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm grateful for the question because this is probably a little bit where I do take issue with Karen's work. as well, and in the sense that I sometimes feel that it's portrayed as if there was this wonderful array of options about what would be prioritized, and the wrong one was picked. And when of course it's so much about what messages will be received by the institution. I suppose just in terms of a little bit of the background, certainly the move, the Rome Statute and then the Security Council were both in important ways about an attempt to harden soft law norms. So what we have out of Beijing is a set of political, and Vienna, a set of political commitments, but a sense that in fact these needed to be codified in an international treaty in terms of the Rome Statute, and in terms of the UN Security Council's unique enforcement mandate through the WPS resolutions. So I definitely think there was perhaps some naive expectations there about what the kind of increased legalization might mean in terms of advocacy, and we see that now. And then my contention is that yes, and this is in the book and it's elsewhere, sexual violence is absolutely it's a focus in mobilization. It's very effective in terms of the sorts of response that it gets from international institutions, and we see that because we've had so many legal developments in that area. But what runs through it also, the second clear theme is around participation, and it is around the idea that these engagements were about trying to access and hold a space in which there would be room for an evolving articulation of feminist demands in international law. And that's and much of that comes from a realization that often women and feminists don't agree, and that actually what you need then is some sort of institutionalization of women's participation in order to allow space for an evolving agenda and an evolving articulation of these demands. And I suppose that's why, whilst I just feel like I agree so much with Karen's analysis, but in tandem with the sexual violence focus has been the participation focus, and that is, and to the extent that people are still trying, I think, to work within the Security Council, for example, it's about actually trying to revive the participation focus in that agenda, because I think there is some acceptance that we won't ever all agree. But if there is some sort of meaningful participation, at least then international law will be a more kind of valid tool for feminist objectives.
Thank you, Catherine. This one is a question about reproductive violence. It is a question that was raised by Diana Bustamante in the chat. And she refers to a situation that is only beginning to be we're only beginning to understand in its full complexity, which are forced abortions for women and for minor women, or just young women specifically, who were members of the now demobilized FARC guerrilla. The specific question Diana is wanting to have addressed is to what extent this qualifies as sexual violence, and also what would be the crime according to international criminal law. How would this be? How could this be dealt with from an international law perspective?
I think that's a Catherine question, because you can do it across the regimes with the definitions.
Certainly it's envisaged. If in terms of the Rome Statute definition of crimes and elements of crimes, it is envisaged. That said, we don't have a prosecution for it. We don't even have charges for it yet at the ICC. So that may be again another example where the doctrine has developed well ahead of the practice. In looking at when I looked at the ICC's engagement with Colombia, it didn't seem to be coming out even in the OTP's discussion of sexual violence in Colombia. It didn't tend to be what they emphasized. So there's certainly, I think, room for development there. Just to reproductive violations more broadly, there has been at the Security Council, there's been some efforts to broaden the women, peace and security agenda and the definition of the sexual violence and the sexual violence focus, in fact, in those resolutions to more directly address women's sexual and reproductive health and rights in the WPS resolutions. And that has been pretty firmly resisted by key states, the former US administration being one of them. So what might seem, I think, obvious to a sort of feminist perspective on these questions, sense that, if we're talking about sexual, even if it's a narrow issue such as sexual violence, we should be able to bring in these other issues. In fact, there's been fairly limited traction, certainly at the Security Council, in those efforts. Where I think we'll find more promise is in the human rights system, where we're seeing certainly much improved, I think, protections around reproductive rights more broadly. Even by the CEDAW committee.
Maybe I'll just add, I think obviously when you're talking about forced abortions, you can get a lot more traction. And that raises some pretty interesting and important strategic concerns. So a lot of the pushback against reproductive rights more generally, that's not what they're thinking about, right? It's often much more around the right to have an abortion.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring you to current affairs. As you know, there are social protests going on Colombian streets. We have completed now over 3 weeks of turmoil, and this has caused all sorts of concerns over human rights violations happening in all directions. And one specific concern that one of the members of our audience is raising relates to possible sexual abuse on behalf of members of the armed forces or the police specifically, with people exerting their right to protest. One of the specific questions here is there have been accusations that police members have not only used excessive force, but that there have been actually acts of sexual assault on women who are taking part in the protests. The question that our audience member raises has to do with to what extent this may seem like a situation in which international law can provide a reference, an answer, a way to address these concerns. And I guess this is a question for Karen.
We probably both have something to say about it. International law has a lot to say, and particularly human rights law. And so I don't even think that my guess is that the Colombian government would not deny that it's not an issue of human rights law, but rather would deny that it's happening. So I think it's a different kind of argument that needs to be made. What will happen on the ground, again, that depends on what avenues are available and whether or not you want to judicialize the issue or protest in other sorts of ways. One of the things though and actually Isabel and I were talking about this the other day, I was trying to understand a little bit better about what the protests are about in Colombia, because one of the things that happens is that once protests start, then you start to see that and are attempted to be quelled with force, then the protest is often about the attempts to quell the protest with force. And so often you forget about what the original protests were focused on. And so I think, in fact, whether any kind of abuse that we'd be talking about by the police, while there needs to continue to be attention to it, I think the challenge is always making sure that because it is sort of easily accepted as a human rights violation, doesn't crowd out the other kinds of arguments that are being made, whether in judicial terms or not. And so I think, I mean, that gets back to the ways in which I fear that, and so it is, human rights more generally ends up, I mean, many people have said this, and not attending to root causes. And then Susan Marks has told us all the problems with attending to root causes, which is we don't really get to the root. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Karen. Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have much to add other than to extend solidarity. The world is watching, just to reassure you. The world is absolutely watching what's going on.
Thanks, Catherine. So just one final question, well, almost final question, refers to an interest that apparently many people in the audience have, which again refers to this question of the forced abortions. Ana Elena Abello asks us on this, asks the following question, and it refers to the fact that many women who entered these illegal organizations consented to the norms that ruled the organization and knew beforehand that should they become pregnant, they would be forced to have an abortion. To what extent does this consenting, I guess, to the rules of the game within the organization somehow affect the analysis referring to international law and its application to this context? I'm sorry, it's not just about abortions, it's also about forced contraception.
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back to the negotiations around the Rome Statute, and one of the really vexed issues was the definition of gender, which was ultimately defined in this quite circuitous way, and there was a proposal. There was discussions about how the issue of forced pregnancy, which I know which is obviously different, but nevertheless related to what you're asking about. So how the issue of forced pregnancy would be dealt with, and in those discussions, places like my own state, Ireland, were very concerned about the codification of a crime of forced pregnancy, for what it might mean for their then very restrictive abortion regimes. And I mean, I raise this only because what you may find a theme here, even in our discussions, that the extent to which states, and mostly men who lead them, spend a lot of time in these discussions talking about how to regulate women's bodies, and the concern that even by implication they might in some way unintentionally liberalize the regulation of women's bodies. And here's where I do think we sort of need to hang on to those foundational feminist insights around the the assumption that law is always the answer. Somebody just wrote a book about it. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much. So just, I guess, one final...
I think Karen might want to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry, Karen, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I mean, this is a political debate, right? And it's one that needs to be had. So, because I think even the way it's framed, you could substitute forced contraception or forced abortion with a lot of other things that people agreed to do when they went into an armed group and engaged in activity. So my concern is that when we, I don't want to overly judicialize it, I guess. I want to hear, because people would have arguments, you could say, well, absolutely, if it's illegal, it doesn't matter that they consented to it. But it seems like even in the way the question is framed, that somebody, not necessarily the question asker, but somebody is articulating, like, actually we were at war and these were the ways that we decided to do things. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. I think there are a lot of embedded issues that deserve attention. But I wouldn't talk about it just whether it's legal or not.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. And I think this was the last question because we're closing up to 10 a.m. and we want to be very conscious of people's time, spending time on Zoom screen. So thank you both so much for this very rich and very detailed conversation. Thank you also in the name of the audience, and I'll just hand it over to Isabel Cristina now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angelika. No, I just turned on my camera to say goodbye and thank Karen and Catherine for the, as you say, Angelika, very rich, very interesting, lots of ideas to keep thinking about this. And Angelika, thanks for being with us today and handling the conversation. And everyone who was here, those who asked the questions, and the others who are here listening, we hope to meet you next June 8th for our last event on criminal investigations of sexual violence in armed conflict context. So thank you very much and have a good day, everyone.